Disclaimer: like Sands of Time, the PC Warrior Within has problems on modern devices that didn't happen at the time of release, although there are various fan-made fixes that improve the experience. The PlayStation 3 remaster once again is absolutely playable, but has audio problems and the image still feels somewhat too sharp. The other consoles don't really have any significant differences besides special time attack and survival modes with online leaderboards on Xbox. Otherwise, this is the same game everywhere. Which also means that it's buggy absolutely everywhere as well. You will encounter tons of random issues, ranging from something harmless like voiceovers not appearing for a bit, to something literally gameplay breaking like time rewind not properly returning destructible objects, or getting teleported to a location you can't get out of. Honestly, there's just so many bugs that it can be quite difficult to enjoy what's a really good game, despite how aesthetically juvenile it is. Don't get me wrong, I don't have anything against the concept of a sequel with a darker tone. In fact, the tonal change works well with the chosen story, one where the prince is chased by the invincible Dahaka due to events of the previous game, and now he tries to change his fate by making it so the Sands of Time never appeared in the first place. However, the way Warrior Within goes for this darker tone is really off. There are some aspects that do work well, mainly the environment design, which is just stunning, both in the crumbling present and the more magical but still ominous past you'll time travel between. Music also deserves a special mention. I think the increased influences of rock and heavy metal fit what Warrior Within is going for. Even the instrumental version of one Godsmack song playing during the Haka chases sits well. I mean, when it plays. Remember, the game is so buggy the music can just get cut off almost immediately. What doesn't really fit though is everything else. First, there is the perpetually angry prince who now keeps talking in a broody voice and likes to swear.
You bitch!
He's so moody that when attacking he just yells without any sort of synchronization to his hits. I mean, come on. And the prince will be violently hitting and killing enemies whose design really gets into twisted perception of BDSM, particularly the woman opponents who love talking about pain in an over-sexualized manner.
There's so much pleasure in pain.
But we can't talk about over-sexualization without mentioning the only two named women in the game, Shadi and Kaylina, aka the Ass Lady and the Boob Lady. While they both wear as little clothing as humanly possible, it's clear that for each, certain body parts were a priority. And look, there's tasteful depictions of kink and sexuality, and then there's this. Material for teenage horny boys who I guess were considered to be the target audience of this game. which is also pretty much a sign of a larger issue with Warrior Within. Very often, it feels like the game tries to hit check marks rather than work towards a particular experience. And this was just one of those check marks. You can sort of see those check marks everywhere. Sense of Time had repetitive combat? Well, Warrior Within implements a free-flow combat system where you can pretty much chain any particular action into the next. Main hand, offhand, which can be armed or unarmed, grab and acrobatics. And this system feels really good, it's just so satisfying to pull all the various moves. Too bad, the enemy design, despite much better behavioral variety than in Sense of Time, adds arbitrary immunities to various moves, so eventually you sort of resort to attacks you find to be the most efficient instead of trying to be creative. I discovered that the one-handed thrown move is particularly overpowered since most enemies aren't immune to it, and a lot of areas have holes or traps or something that will kill them instantly. Sure, you won't get sand tanks that way, but there is enough vases in the game you can break for those anyway. I mean, when the randomly chosen animation allows you to. But even outside of the immunity factor punishing creativity, there's just a bunch of weird mechanical quirks anyway. Now, I won't criticize changing the timing of counterattacks from Sense of Time's button press right before the weapon hits to right after the weapon hits, although me being used to how it worked in Sense of Time made me mess up on numerous occasions. But okay, there is new timing, I can accept that. What I can't accept is other enemies being able to attack you during your pretty lengthy counter animations. There is no animation cancel and no way to predict if someone else is going to attack, since a counter is a reactive action, so it just feels punishing. Especially considering that there are some enemies whose attack chain isn't interrupted when you counter, effectively rendering it useless since they hit you before Prince finishes doing his swirly thing. Which is weird considering that even bosses have their attack chain interrupted by a counter. And bosses are another checkmark. In Sense of Time there were only 2 encounters that could be called boss fights, but they weren't even really boss fights per se. Well, Warrior Within adds actual boss fights. They're bad. Sudden grab attacks with no wind-ups, random kicks that send you across half the arena that can't be predicted, repetitive attack chains over and over again, it's just not enjoyable to fight these bosses. The best one, which I'm not going to show for spoiler reasons, is just bearable, mainly because you can abuse the hell out of your sand powers during the fight. Speaking of sand powers, that's another checkmark, cause Warrior Within has added more. Technically. You have the power of a sand blast, a stronger sand blast, and even stronger sand blast. Yeah, 3 of the 6 powers are just stronger versions of each other, while the rest are repurposed existing mechanics from Sense of Time. Although the Mega Freeze variant not only feels useless for the most part, but also looks ridiculous. The time rewind though is as useful as ever, and the time slow-mo now actually doesn't slow the prince down, which makes it an actual improvement, helping not only in combat scenarios, but allowing for time-sensitive puzzles or parkour sections during exploration. Plus, if you're having issues with traps, you can always slow the time down to make things a little easier for you. Speaking of traps and level design in general, it's really good, but not without caveats. The thing about parkour and trap segments in Sense of Time that made them special is how they managed to fit into the world of the game. It made sense. In Warrior Within, it's just gameplay segments, you know? Oh, there's a mechanical tower. What does it do in the context of the game's world? Well, it opens a lock to a door. There's the gardens. What is their purpose? They open a second lock. The checkmarks for more elaborate parkour sections and more cool different looking environments are hit, sure, but why do those things exist? Does the Empress of Time have to traverse through all these traps and bottomless pits every time she wants to go from the entrance of the palace to her throne room? Why would anyone build this contraption raising sort of artificial cliff faces in various directions? Does this palace exist as a test for someone? But it wasn't supposed to be ever found. And look, it's not a requirement for a game to try and explain its level challenges in the context of the world. Many good games survive well enough without that. And if Warrior Within would be some standalone Prince of Persia game, it's likely I would just accept it, suspend my disbelief. But this is a direct sequel to a game that has created certain expectations in terms of world building. There's also the question of interconnectivity. Sands of Time with its linear levels made it feel like the Palace of Azad is a single interconnected space. The Island of Time in Warrior Within is an actual interconnected space, which means you will do a lot of backtracking. Through space you don't understand how it should operate logically. And yeah, some backtracking segments try to add something new or interesting into the mix, but also there's a lot of examples in the last parts of the game especially, where you're just redoing the same segments you've already done several times. It gets boring and just unnecessarily prolongs the playtime and slows down the pacing without adding anything meaningful to the equation in terms of secrets or exploration. Although the latter aspect is a bit more elaborate than in Sands of Time. The life upgrades are far better hidden this time, and should you find all of them, you'll be able to see the real canon ending to the game, which involves a sex scene, a very awkward one. Of course, that should have been expected from Warrior Within, I guess. Anyway, all this is not to say that there is absolutely zero connection between the gameplay of Warrior Within and the narrative it tries to tell. There is actually some pretty cool stuff, some of which I can't show for spoiler reasons. But I do really like the increased importance of both water and sand and the dichotomy between them. Both elements existed in Sands of Time, but here they're actually more interconnected. Water, in a way, is a cleansing entity representing safety from the danger of the sands. One way the game does that is by contextualizing save points and health refill respectively, of course, only as water fountains. Which means Prince's hydration habits are much more hygienic than in Sands of Time. But also water protects from sand beings like the Dahaka, whose relentless chasing can't be stopped by anything else. In some prolonged chase segments in the second half of the game you just can't wait to find a waterfall so you could get a breather. The sense from their part, well, I can't actually elaborate on that without again some significant spoilers. I suppose one reason why the abstraction of the game's world feels so weird to me is because the narrative in Warrior Within attempts to be much more elaborate than in Sands of Time, which had a pretty simple, classic, straightforward, but well-told story. The story of Warrior Within to me is very interesting on a conceptual level. The explored themes of fate and inevitability of death, the character arcs, the important plot beats, they're really good. But the representation of the tale falls flat. And it's not only because the writing isn't particularly great, mostly because of the juvenile attempts at feeling mature, but just in general, all the various parts of the game sort of live in their own world. The story, the character arcs, the sudden wave-handedly explained shift in Prince's personality, the Island of Time, the gameplay, the pace-halting backtracking, they don't help each other, and it's most evident with the twist that happens when the story switches gears from the second to third act. Again, conceptually, it is really cool, and some parts of it were set up beforehand, but as a whole it just comes out of nowhere and feels like an ass pull. Not that kind of ass. All this is not to say that Warrior Within is a bad game. As I said from the get-go, it's really good. The combat system is great, the level design often provides some very fun scenarios, and there's a number of really creative segments, and the Dahaka chases are emotional highlights for a reason. But all this great stuff is spruced up by, well, stuff like this. Or running past the same giant for the third time during the course of the game, alongside some other encounters you eventually just run past cause combat still starts feeling monotonous after a while, so I guess that particular checkmark wasn't really hit, was it? Warrior Within gets a Stasocritic rating of 75. It's definitely not as consistent and thought out as Sands of Time. But at the same time, I guess it wouldn't be fair to criticize Warrior Within for not living up to an almost perfect game, and being pretty good is, well, pretty good. Just make sure your expectations are fully aligned when trying Warrior Within out.